Well, last weekend we kicked off Thrive, and we talked about what it means to be rooted and established in love. It's really easy for us to find our identity in a number of different things, but Paul, speaking to this vibrant, upstart church in Ephesus, is telling them, find it. Stay rooted and established in love, in the love that God has for you. Now, the first 3 chapters of Ephesians is Paul's full throttle attempt to remind you of who you already are in Christ. 3 chapters of him telling you, this is who you are. This is who you really are. This is you. Now, you're made up of experiences, good, bad, struggles, pain, and beauty. You're made up of abilities, these gifts that have been uniquely wired in you, and a personality, the demeanor, the tone, the introvert, the extrovert, the humor, and this heart. What gets you passionate? What fires you up? What makes you come alive? This is you. And no one has ever walked this planet has your precise makeup. When you get to heaven, God is not going to ask you, why weren't you more like Moses? Why weren't you more like this person or that person? You know what he's going to ask you? Why weren't you more like you? The person I intended for this earth. See, the first 10 verses of Ephesians chapter 2 are rich in detail about the spiritual journey. For this vibrant young church in the heart of Ephesus, a 250,000 person city, Paul wants to both remind and unleash them for kingdom good. But he begins chapter 2 by taking them back and reminding them first of who they once were. Paul writes, as for you. Now imagine yourself in that house as this letter from Paul is being read. As for you, as for every living, breathing person in this room or watching online, Paul says, you were dead. There was no pulse, no vitality, no growth. You were the antithesis of thriving. You had stumbled far, far, far away from God. And even farther from home. This was your spiritual state. This was our spiritual state. Now, when I was in high school, we had this older woman who ran the scoreboard for our basketball team. And when I'd check in to enter the game, she'd always have something fun and snarky to say. I'd walk in, she'd look at me and go, you finally gonna show up and play now? Which was very encouraging. One time I remember she pulled me close and she said, come here. With all those bricks you've been shooting, I can add an extension to my house, thank you. I absolutely loved her. So snarky and so fun, but one day over Christmas break, she was out shopping and had a brain aneurysm. And she was taken to the hospital, transferred to the intensive care unit, and within a few days was pronounced dead. News spread quickly in our small town, and I found out the hospital that she was at, and I drove to it as quick as I could, and I actually snuck into ICU. I walked beside her bed, sat down, and just held her hand. She'd wanted to be an organ donor, so they were keeping her alive by machines. Wires. So many wires beeping to keep her breathing. And I didn't know that she had already passed. But for a good hour, I sat beside her, holding her hand, praying and reminiscing. She was dead, yet breathing. And this is the picture that Paul is painting, that each of us were the walking dead. Dead, yet breathing. Breathing, but far, far, far from home. Ephesians 1:1 says, as for you, you were dead in your trespasses and sins. I don't know about you, but every time I see one of those no trespassing signs, something inside me just wants to enter. Like, look at this sign right here. There's a chain link fence. There's probably so much fun back there, isn't there? I mean, there's kind of clouds in the back. You're like, man, I bet there's such good stuff back there. And all through growing up, I'd see those signs, and it was like an invitation. Like, there's got to be more on the other side. I'd climb fences. I'd walk in. I'd go check it out. High school, the same thing. I mean, I'm curious about it. And the truth is, it takes us back to the garden because there was one massive no trespassing sign. And yet, for many of us, just like that first man and woman, we've often wondered, is God holding back? And found ourselves entering into places, not trusting God, but entering into different places. When I was in junior high, I played for a soccer team that represented the state of California in Great Britain. And we were sponsored by Virgin Airlines. Everywhere we went, we wore shirts that just said Virgin. I think the Brits were pranking us. Anyway, we happened to go to an event in London, and we got word that the Queen and the Duke would be coming. So I figured they would enter through a back entrance. So I saw the no trespassing sign, and I looked the other way. And I proceeded ahead. And then a motorcade pulled up, a whole bunch of SUVs, and then one nice car, which I knew had to be where the Queen was. And so I ran up to this nice-looking Rolls Royce, and I had like one of those wind-up cameras. Remember those? I'm like winding it, and I go to take a picture of the Queen, and am tackled by 4 security officers. But I got this great 45-degree angle picture of the Queen, which is awesome. It's amazing. Paul's saying, as for you, you were dead in your trespasses. Paul is saying that we wandered east of Eden, climbing over the chain link fence, neglecting the sign, and still proceeding ahead. We drifted into unfamiliar territory, and unlike the prodigal son who knew his way back, Paul simply states that we were stuck, finished, alone, wandering. We were dead, yet breathing. Now, what I want you to see is that in these first 10 verses of chapter 2, Paul is talking about the spiritual journey, and he begins by saying, this is who you were. You were dead. You were dead. This, my friends, is the plight of humanity without God. And right here, I guarantee you, many of you are starting to get a little squirrely. Defense mechanisms are kicking in. You're telling yourself, I'm not that bad. I grew up in church. My spouse is that bad, or some other family member. Definitely that coworker of mine. They've done some trespassing. Maybe a little bit I've done. I'm not that bad. I'm pretty good. I'm pretty good. And Paul says, not so fast. As for you, you were dead. Paul continues to say that all of us lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath. See, we started delighting in trespassing. We filled our lives with the desires of our bodies. We took what we wanted, when we wanted, how we wanted, and we didn't even blink an eye. With every choice, we found ourselves farther and farther and farther from home. And because of this, Paul is saying we deserved to never be invited back. Is that you? Are there a place in your life that you find yourself trespassing, climbing fences, delighting in struggles and pain? Friends, what's that place, that thing, that secret that you've deliberately neglected the sign, climbed the fence, and in your heart, you know you're far from home, far from who you were created to be, far from who you want to be. You're dead, yet breathing. And Paul so brilliantly then flips the script. If these first couple of verses were to show us the plight of humanity without God, then these next few show us the privilege of humanity with God. Paul says, but Because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in our trespasses. It is by grace you have been saved. Let me just tell you, friends, that the first 7 verses of chapter 2 are one gigantic run-on sentence, 104 words of Paul just emoting the journey of our existence. And what he's saying here in this powerful verse is, but you were dead, but because of his great love, God, who is rich in mercy, made a way. Made a way for you to be alive. In view of all of your trespasses, by grace you can be saved. And what Paul's saying here is there is this beautiful reality of the cross. And because of that, you have the chance to be alive. And it all exists because of 2 words. 2 words that kind of Paul uses in that phrase underscore the entirety of the gospel, capturing the essence of God's character and showcasing what is possible. Those 2 words, but God. But because of his great love, God, in his rich mercy, made a way for you to be alive. See, as for you, as for me, we were dead. But God, as for you, as for me, many of us struggling with issues of control. But God, as for you, as for me, having addictions, hurts, habits, and hang-ups. But God. That is the gospel. That is the good news. That even though every one of us were dead, but God made us alive. I don't know about you, but that just gets me so fired up. But God, because of his unfathomable love, his wealth of mercy, he made us alive with Christ. He neglected the sign. He climbed the fence, and he found us. We are no longer the walking dead, and we have been invited to thrive. That's what I'm talking about. That's some good news, right? See, God's love pursued us even when we ran away. God's mercy saw us even when we were down and out and helpless. God's grace looked past it all and it liberated us. And Paul says it again, for it is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not from yourselves, it is a gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. It's a gift. This whole movement is about nothing you did. No room for you to boast. It's all a gift. It's grace that found you, grace that saved you. It's all a gift of grace. But our culture is profoundly good at co-opting beautiful things about God to be about us, isn't it? See, during Paul's day, the Greeks and the Romans, they had all of these bizarre ideas about the gods. They had this thought that there were these gods, kind of like think fairies and Tinkerbell kind of things, that were out there. And these gods would almost send these kind of little fairies to kind of actually help you have happiness or help you with creativity. And the Greeks and the Romans had this word. It was called eudaimonia. And this word meant to be well-daemoned. A daemon was the name of these kind of fairy things. Now, Elizabeth Gilbert says this, that the Greeks and the Romans believed that their happiness was taken care of by some external daemon spirit guide, one for happiness, and they also believed that each person had an external spirit guide for creativity. Gilbert says that the Romans had a specific term for that helpful deity. They called it your genius. Your guardian deity, the conduit of your inspiration, which is to say the Romans didn't believe that an exceptionally gifted person was a genius. They believed that an exceptionally gifted person had a genius. It's interesting though, Because we now refer to each other as geniuses. My kid's a genius. I wish my kid was a genius. Wasn't that a genius idea? You are a genius. And I tell you this because we are so good at co-opting ideas and making ourselves the focal point all the time. Something in us wants to find a way to do the same thing with grace. And Paul is absolute in his resolve that we just can't do it. God knows if we could, we'd find a way to make it about us. And if we could, it would cease to be grace. The invitation is to simply just receive the gift that you are worth loving. This is who you are. But here's what happens. I meet a number of people who know this part of their story, and they meet Jesus, and there is this profound move of God. The hands are wide open. They receive this gift of grace, and then they just wait. They wait for heaven. They wait for the day that they can enter the gates. They wait for a life where they can be with God. And all they do is they keep this grace to themselves. And they talk about it. I've been saved by God's good grace. They sing about it, and it's very deeply personal to them, and it's beautiful, and they know who they once were. They know who they are. They are alive, and for many people, they believe that this is the end of the story. You have received it. Now wait till the day you die and enter heaven. That's not what Paul was teaching. See, Paul says, when you were dead, but God, and you were alive, and God has something so much more. He's like, but God doesn't even just stop there. There's more. There's way more. Look what the scriptures say, Ephesians 2:10. For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. Workmanship is the word in Greek poema. And Paul is saying we are poetry on God's lips. Poema is the idea of a great poem, a great story. Words being strung together to tell a grand story. This is who you are. Other Bible translations will use words like handiwork or masterpiece. Walt Whitman declares, and your very flesh shall be a great poem. See, the idea is that Paul had this belief that there was like this vision 210. This idea that you were a masterpiece. And the truth is that many of us don't believe that is true. I think for many of us, we know, oh yeah, I was broken and fractured. There was so much sin and pain in my life. And then God, through the cross, wrecked my life, transformed me, made me alive, and we just stop there. And Paul's saying, no, you don't understand. You got more. You were saved by God's good grace. And you were saved for God's good work. You got stuff to do. You got to show the world what God is like, how God has wired and made you. You get to put on display how unique God is. You got to think about Ephesus. Everywhere you went were these massive sculptures, artists galore, sculptures being down every main road. Art was the language of that day. You think of a temple, Artemis's temple. It was the seventh wonder of the world. People showed up just to see it, and they looked at this building. They were captured and enamored, and Paul is saying, yeah, forget all that. You want to know what a masterpiece is? It's you. Ephesus has nothing on you. The Art Institute in Chicago has nothing on you. You in God's story are a masterpiece. And the truth is, we don't believe it. I mean, we believe in grace. And can you imagine if every one of us believed that we were a masterpiece in God's story? Can you imagine if we actually believed in the core of our being that God wired and made us for a reason, for such a time as this? There would not even be an empty seat in this room. There would be a group of people who were so enamored by Vision 2:10 that Paul was speaking to this church to actually go out there and shine, to let their lives be put on display, to not hold this grace inside, but to give it away in whatever they did. In the marketplace, in the schools, in the theater of that day, or in our day, it would be to shine and actually live into that masterpiece. See, to make this leap from alive to masterpiece, it requires trust. It requires trust. The trust and belief that you were made for something so much more. You might know this, but Hitler was an amazing artist. Amazing artist. He took his inheritance and he left